In this video, I'm going to show how to assess the risk and material misstatement for the payroll cycle. This is the third step in auditing the payroll cycle. In the previous videos, we talked about understanding the company's payroll cycle and then identifying significant accounts and assertions that are being made by management. Here, we're going to talk about how to assess the risk and material misstatement. And a quick review, the risk and material misstatement is a function of two things: inherent risk and control risk. So let's start by talking about inherent risk for the payroll cycle. So, quick refresher, inherent risk is the risk that a material misstatement will occur in the absence of internal controls. Now, we're going to hope as the auditor that that client has some really strong internal controls, but for right now, when we're thinking about inherent risk, we're going to forget about the internal controls and just say, how risky are the payroll transactions, the accounts that we're looking at? Okay, so inherent risk is high related to the payroll cycle when you have several different risk factors. For example, if you have a significant amount of executive compensation, then inherent risk can be high. Why is that the case? Well, if you think about it, executives like the CEO, the CFO have the power to override internal controls, and they also have an incentive to try and make their compensation as high as possible. So you might have issues like options backdating or other frauds that can occur. So if you have a very high level of executive compensation, there's going to be more inherent risk. Also, if you have a lot of share-based compensation, why is there issues with share-based compensation? Because there's estimation and judgment involved in applying the pricing models to try and determine the fair value of any stock options that are being granted to employees or to executives. Okay. Now, if you have a high amount of employee turnover, so you constantly have this company, you have people quitting and they're hiring new people, frequent hiring and firing is going to increase inherent risk because that might be easier for a dishonest employee to add a fictitious, aka ghost employee to the payroll, or to keep someone who's been fired on the payroll and continue to pay them and then steal the checks. So basically, if you have a company that's hiring and firing hundreds of people every quarter, then that's going to make it easier for someone to slip in a couple fictitious employees and then steal those fictitious employees' checks. But if the company very rarely hires an employee or fires someone, you have very low turnover, then this would obviously be more noticeable if some fraud like that happens. So high employee turnover is going to mean a higher inherent risk. Now, also, if the company has labor contracts, for example, they have union, so the workers are unionized, any kind of labor agreements can make it a little more challenging in terms of calculating the payroll-related liabilities, so that can also increase inherent risk as well. So you got a lot of executive compensation, share-based compensation, high employee turnover, those types of things, you're going to have higher inherent risk. Now, let's talk about control risk. Remember, we said the risk and material misstatement was a function of inherent risk and control risk. And we talked about inherent risk. Now we're going to talk about control risk. So control risk, the risk a material misstatement would not be prevented or detected by the client's internal controls. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about several future videos. I'm going to go into specific internal controls the client should have and so forth, how the auditor would go about testing the effectiveness of those internal controls. So right now, I just want to give you a basic overview of what the auditor would do in terms of setting control risk. So the first thing is understanding and documenting the internal control process. And we've got the 5 components of internal control here. Thinking about doing a walkthrough and really understanding the client's payroll cycle, and then asking yourself, who has the authority to do certain actions in this payroll cycle? For example, who has the authority to add a new employee? Okay, so who has the authority to do that? And are there systems in place for doing things? For example, when a new employee is added, is there a system in place for doing that? Or is it just, just Susie handles that. We don't really have a system. We just trust her to take care of that and so forth, okay? So you wanna do a walkthrough of the payroll process, understand who has the authority to do certain things, what systems are in place, and so forth. Now, the auditor is also gonna test, so they're not only gonna understand the design of the internal controls, which is first say, okay, what controls are even in place, but they're also going to do tests of the controls. And as I said, I will make another video going into the specific types of tests they'll have. But just in general, just telling you obviously speak with the client's personnel, inspect documents. An example of that would be, let's say the company pays their hourly employees, and so they've got hourly employees and they have them submit time cards or time sheets showing the hours that they've worked. So if they do that, one thing that there should be a supervisor who signs off and says, okay, in fact, this employee did work 40 hours. And so you could go and inspect those documents and check some of those timesheets and see, okay, in fact, do they have signatures of supervisors? You could observe the control being applied by the client's personnel, or the auditor could reperform the control themselves. So there are a number of things they can do. And like I said, I'll get into more detail in the videos to come. Now, they've done the test of control, so they understand what the controls are. They test the effectiveness of the controls. Then the auditor is going to go and set the achieved level of control risk. So, okay, in fact, what is the level of control risk? If the level of control risk, so the auditor initially had some idea what the control risk was going to be, but then they go and test the effectiveness of the controls, and it might be higher or lower the achieved level of risk than what they had thought. If the achieved level of control risk is a lot higher than what they had initially planned, then the auditor is going to say, oh, okay, wait a minute. We tested these internal controls. They're not as effective as we thought, or there's more issues than we thought. So then they're going to have to do additional substantive procedures to compensate for that, okay? Because remember, ultimately, the whole reason that we're calculating the risk of material misstatement, which I should put an extra M there, RMM, the risk of material misstatement, is ultimately the auditor needs to determine how to set detection risk. Okay, they need to set detection risk. And so if we come back to our initial thing, I said risk of material misstatement, RMM, is a function of inherent risk and control risk. And we just talked about both of those, okay? Now, the risk of material misstatement, okay, so audit risk is a function of the risk of material misstatement and detection risk. So how does this all play? Let me just put this in normal people's words, right? So risk of material misstatement is, before the auditor even gets involved and does any substantive procedures or anything like that, what is the risk that we have a material misstatement? Okay, so assuming the auditor hasn't done anything yet, they haven't gone and done any tests, just what is the risk that there's some kind of material misstatement in this client's financials? Okay, so that's the risk of material misstatement. Now, the detection risk is what the auditor has control over. So if the auditor were to do more substantive procedures than what they had planned, they said, no, we're going to do a lot of tests. We're going to do twice or 3 times as many tests. Okay, so that is affecting detection risk. So in other words, the auditor goes and says, hey, what's the risk of material misstatement? Which I talked about. We'd say, what's the inherent risk? What's the control risk? They determine risk of material misstatement. And they say, okay, we want audit risk to be at a certain level, right? We want a very low chance that we're going to have an audit failure here. Now, if risk of material misstatement is high, then the auditor is going to need to set detection risk lower to counterbalance that and keep audit risk at an acceptable level. And they would do that by performing more substantive procedures. Now, we're going to talk about understanding the client's internal controls, testing the operating effectiveness of those controls, and then performing substantive procedures in the videos to come.